Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Sunday. Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who is in the house on a Sunday? Guy in Ohio, Shindor in the Bronx, Ehud in South Carolina, Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Tom in PA. And hi, I'm in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella, Rochelle, and Frank in San Pedro. Welcome, everybody. Our daf tonight is page 69 here in Tractate Bava Basra, 23rd volume of the Talmud. Continuing our journey through chapter 4. Tonight, with God's help, opening and completing, opening Mishna number 8. We picked this up about a little more than halfway. Near the bottom of page 68b. Okay. Bottom of page 68b, Mishnah number 8. One who sells a field. And worth remembering that tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh Elul, which is Tuesday and Wednesday this week. So begins the night before. Beautiful teaching that Nina shared with me on Shabbos. I think that she got from Avigdor Miller. Nina will correct me if I'm wrong. But a kind of spiritual teaching about why the Jewish calendar begins every day at night. Right? So the obvious reason is that in the story of creation, there was evening and there was morning the first day. There was evening and there was morning the second day, etc. But also this idea that the world that we live in, although there can be many bright lights around you, I'm looking into a light here that lights me up for the show, beautiful sun outside, etc. Nevertheless, it's a world of darkness because God's presence is hidden. This is a place where we have free will, and if we're going to allow ourselves to be pulled in any which way by our animal urges, so we'll remain in darkness. But if we learn and educate ourselves and study, not just the Torah that's in front of us, not just the written Torah, not just the oral Torah, but also make an actual careful study of how we can improve our midos, improve our character traits, then we're going to be well on our way to illuminating ourselves, our path, and becoming a source of light to others around us. So that begins tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh, the first day of Elul. And when Elul begins, which is the last month of the year, and thus the precursor to the first month, right? And the first day of the year is Rosh Hashanah. So this coming month, starting tomorrow night, the last month of the year is this time of introspection, right? A time where we examine ourselves, make an accounting of where we are, the goals that we had last year. Did we meet them? Why didn't we meet them? Where do we need to make improvement? That's something that we want to be doing all day this month. I'm very inspired by Nina, who has made a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Disciplined practice of learning Musar, and inspired by her, I'm planning to learn Musar. I just want to do 5 minutes a day, every day, of Musar, and Musar is really about improving one's character traits. There are many Musar texts, Mussar. Very famous one is The Path of the Just by the Ramchal, Rabbi Luzzatto. But there's others. So if you Google Musar, and on Sefaria, there's a whole section of Musar texts. So that's, there's just a wonderful selection of old and middle-aged and newer, old meaning 2,000 years old, middle meaning 500 to 1,000 years old, and newer in the last 500 years, texts that you can use to study Musar and to make a practice of, as the Ramchal says, it's almost a given that if we are learning Torah, we're studying Talmud, we want to grow in our spirituality. Well, what is it that we want to grow in? We want to grow in our love of God and our fear of God, improving the caliber and quality of our thoughts, our service to God. But if we don't actually make a study of that, and how to do it, then why are we going to grow in love of God? How are we going to grow in fear of God? How are we going to bring that wisdom into our hearts? So I challenge all of us to, be disciplined during this month of Elul and really examining our deeds, bringing in, sort of the experts from the Musar tradition, or if you prefer Hasidus. I mean, there's so many areas, but take on a little extra study this month, and Musar is such a good way to go. And so I'm beginning that with Elul, and that's a wonderful thing to do in Elul, and that's why I made this digression, because right now we're learning one who sells a field. We're talking about a field, and the first Lubavitcher Rebbe said, the Alter Rebbe, that in Elul, the king is in the field. The king is God, of course. What does it mean? God is everywhere. What does it mean that the king is in the field? This idea that, like an earthly king that leaves the palace and is now traveling around the kingdom in his, wagon with his retinue, looking at the subjects, and he's taking questions, and he's receiving comments, and he's shaking hands. He's ready to meet with you, and he's much closer to you. Who could get in the palace? Who can pass the moat and the gate and all the guards? It's all impossible to access when he's in the palace. But when he's out in the field, God is so much closer, so much more available to us. And it makes sense that when we're examining our deeds, why are we doing that? Because we want to make a teshuvah, we want to make an atonement, we want to make a turn, we want to make that improvement that's going to bring us closer to God, and God loves it that we do that, appreciates when we do that, and therefore God makes God's self more available to us in this period. The king is in the field. Okay, back to our Mishnah. One who sells a field without specifying what is included in the sale has sold the stones in the field that are for its use, and the reeds in the vineyard that are for its use, and the produce that is still attached to the ground, and the cluster of reeds that occupy less than the area required for sowing a quarter kav of seed. This is known as a base rova. In other words, an area defined by reeds that surround it, but it's smaller than what we would actually call a field. Therefore, it's included in the field, right? As opposed to an area, I just said I'm selling you that field over there. Well, there's a part of the field that is defined by the reeds surrounding it and is of the size of an area that could be called a field. Well, I'm not selling you two fields, I'm selling you one field. So if there's an area that could be defined as a separate field, so it's not included. And the watch station that is not plastered with clay, and the young carob tree that has not been grafted, and the untrimmed sycamore that is still young. These things have all been sold along with the field. But he has not sold along with the field the stones that are not designated for use in the field. Like I have a pile of stones there, it's building materials. I'm selling you a field. I'm not selling you my movable property that's sitting on that field, right? If I have a car on that field, you don't think I'm selling you my car. unless I specify that it is included with the sale. And likewise, this pile of stones, since it hasn't been designated as something to, make an improvement on that field, okay, so it's my stones, my pile of stones. I'm going to take them with me when I leave this field behind. And not the reeds in the vineyard that are not designated for its use. In other words, I have a bunch of reeds that could be used to prop up grapevines or other kinds of plants, kind of equipment that can be used for farming, but is not necessarily used for farming this field. I might want to take it with me to my other fields. I'm only selling you the field, not that equipment. And also, I'm not including the produce, or, I haven't specified, but I just said I'm selling you a field, so this would not include the produce that is already detached from the ground. I already farmed it, harvested it, I need to sell it, it's sitting on that field, but I'm not selling you that. I'm going to sell that myself, it's ready to be sold. Now, when the seller says to the buyer, I am selling you it and everything that is in it, that's the same formula we've been using over and over again as we've examined selling different things from a city to a house to a courtyard. Now that we're selling a field, if the seller says, I'm selling you it and everything that is in it, so then all these components are sold along with the field. But in this case and in that case, meaning even if I I just say I'm selling you a field, or I say it and everything that is in it, even so, the following things are not going to be included. So I have not sold the cluster of reeds that occupy a base rova or more, as they are considered a separate field, and the seller has not sold the watch station that is plastered with clay, and not the carob tree that has been grafted, and not the sycamore trunk. All of these entities are significant in their own right and have a status independent from that of the fields, and they are therefore not included in the sale of the field. We could certainly agree in the bill of sale that I'm going to include these things, but absent actually specifying that they're included, they're not. That is the Mishnah. Now we're on page 69a, and we begin the Gemara. So the Mishnah teaches that one who sells a field has sold the stones in the field that are for its use. And the Gemara clarifies what is meant by stones that are for its use. Here in Bava, Babylonia, they interpreted it as follows. Stones are placed on the sheaves in the field to protect them from being scattered by the wind. These are not just rocks. These are particular stones that are part of farming equipment. So Ula says the Mishnah is referring to stones that are arranged for the future building of a fence for that field, designated for a fence to that field. And the Gemara asks, but didn't Rabbi Chia teach us in a Baraisa that they are stones that are piled up for the future building of a fence and not necessarily arranged? And the Gemara answers, teach that Rabbi Chia said they are stones that are arranged for the future building of a fence, right? In other words, they're not just a pile of stones, they're a pile of stones that have been gathered for the purpose of building a fence. And there's something about that pile that we understand they were set there to build a fence around this field, and that's why they're included. Now, the Gemara elaborates on the two explanations. It was stated that here in Babylonia, they interpreted the Mishnah as referring to the stones that are placed on the sheaves, right? In other words, they're used. What are sheaves? Sheaves are when you're harvesting your grain, and so you make bundles, right, of the harvested stalks. You tie them up, you leave them there. That's a sheaf, plural sheaves, right? And later you come by with your wagon and collect them. What if a big wind comes along before you come back with your wagon? The sheaves might blow away and scatter. These rocks are used for weighing down the sheaves to protect them from scattering in the wind. According to Rabbi Meir, this should be understood as referring to stones that are ready to be used to protect the sheaves, even though they are not placed on the sheaves. And this is in keeping with Rabbi Meir's opinion that whenever a place is sold, all the accompaniments that are necessary for proper utilization of that property, in this case a field, are included in the sale. And according to the rabbis, the Mishnah is referring specifically to stones that are already placed on the sheaves. And according to Ula, who says that the Mishnah is referring to stones that are arranged for the future building of a fence for the field, According to Rabbi Meir, stones that are ready to be used for building a fence are also included in the sale, even though they are not arranged for that purpose. According to the rabbis, the Mishna is referring specifically to stones that are already arranged for the building of the fence, not just gathered. And the Gemara, in other words, like they've been laid out along the property line where they're going to become a fence, and what's lacking is to stack them and mortar them, etc. Now, the Gemara continues with its clarification of the Mishnah, which teaches that one who sells a field has also sold the reeds in the vineyard that are for its use. So the Gemara asks, with regard to the reeds, what is their purpose in the vineyard? So the sages of the school of Rabbi Yanai said, these are reeds that are split on top and placed under the vines so that the boughs of the vines can rest on them. In other words, they take sticks, they split the top. Now it's something that, you can stick in the ground and rest something heavy on top of it, and it'll be kept off the ground. Why do you want to keep it off the ground? Because you might have grapevines that are quite fecund, and they're growing big clusters of grapes, and if the big clusters of grapes grow too near the ground, so they're going to come into contact with the dirt, they're going to be overly wet and moist in the mornings, and the grapes will rot. So you want to keep those clusters of grapes off the ground, and you use these particular kinds of reeds or sticks that are designed for that purpose, right? So this is farming equipment. What's the word I'm looking for? Vineyard operating equipment, right? Vintner equipment. Okay. The reeds are split on top and placed under the vines so that the boughs of the vines can rest on them. So according to Rabbi Meir, this is referring, he disagrees. He says this is referring to reeds that have been smoothed and made ready for this purpose, even though they are not yet set in their place. So according to the rabbis, the Mishnah refers specifically to reeds that are already set in their place. If they're set in their place, if they're clearly being used as equipment for this field, so they go along with the field. But if it's more like raw materials that can become reeds used to hold up vines, so they still belong to the seller, they're not inherently part of the field. And when he sells the field, he's not selling that bundle of raw materials for these kind of prop-up reeds. Now, the Gemara continues expounding the Mishnah, which includes, among the components that are sold with a field, the produce that is still attached to the ground. Okay, so produce that's still attached to the ground. That sounds like inherently part of the field. As opposed to produce that's already been harvested, so it's no longer attached to the ground, that stands ready to be sold, and it is no longer an integral part of the field. Now, the Gemara comments, even though the time has already come for the produce to be cut down, it is included in the sale since it is still attached to the ground. And the Mishnah also includes among the things that are sold with a field the cluster of reeds that occupy less than a base rova. So the Gemara notes, even though these reeds are thick, they are still classified as part of the field. You might have thought that these reeds are ready to be cut down and used as other kinds of equipment, but they're still attached to the ground, and therefore they go along with the field. Now, the Mishnah teaches that one who sells a field sells with it the watch station that is not plastered with clay. Now, what I'm imagining here, what's the watch station, right? So this is a little hut, maybe an elevated hut, that your shomer, your guard, is going to occupy when he's watching your field. Why is he doing that? Because it's late in the season. The field is ready to be harvested. Ethically challenged people might come by and just start stealing your crop. So you've got guards out there, right? Because these fields, very often people lived in walled cities and towns for their protection, and their fields were outside, right? They would walk from the town to their fields. Not like the sort of setup we imagine, well, all the farmers have farmhouses beside their fields. No, it's not necessarily like that at all. People lived in towns and their fields were outside the towns. So they had no eye on their field unless they put some guards out there. And so these watch stations would house those guards. Is that inherently part of the field? On the one hand, you say, well, obviously it's inherently part of the field. It's the place where your guard is watching the field. On the other hand, if it's movable equipment, okay, so you could, disassemble that watch station, take it to where you have fields that you didn't sell, and use it there. So it's much more like movable property. So let's keep going. The Mishnah teaches that one who sells a field sells it with the watch station that is not plastered with clay, which makes it what? Much more movable, portable, easily disassembled and taken somewhere else. But if it's plastered with clay, much more like a hut that's installed on that field. Now the Gemara comments, even though it is not fixed in the ground and can still be moved, since it is not plastered, it is not significant enough to be considered an independent entity, and it is considered part of the field. So the Mishnah also includes the following among the components that are sold with the field, and the carob tree that has not been grafted, and the untrimmed sycamore. So the Gemara notes, even though they are big and thick, since they have not yet reached the stage of grafting, in the case of the carob, or trimming in the case of the sycamore, they are considered part of the field. Meaning if the sycamore was large enough that its limbs were ready to be used for lumber, harvested for lumber, and it was clear that you were sort of growing them out so that when they were big enough, you would cut them down and sell them as lumber. So if they had reached that stage, okay, then it's just like something that's ready to be sold, even if it's attached to the ground. But if it's not that significant, then it's not ready to be sold, and it is integrally part of the field. The Gemara proceeds to explain the second half of our Mishnah, which teaches, but he has not sold along with the field the stones that are not designated for use in the field. So on the assumption that the Mishnah speaks of stones that are placed on the sheaves to prevent them from being scattered in the wind, according to Rabbi Meir, the Mishnah is referring to stones that are not ready to be used for this purpose. Whereas, according to the rabbis, even if the stones are ready to be used to protect the sheaves, they are not included in the sale if they are not yet placed on them, because it's like movable property that the seller might want to take with him to his other fields. And according to Ula, who says that the Mishnah is referring to stones that are arranged for the future building of a fence for the field, according to Rabbi Meir, this clause addresses a case where the stones are not ready to be used for this purpose, whereas according to the rabbis, it addresses a case where the stones were not yet arranged for building a fence, even though they were ready to be used for that purpose. The stones are suitable for making a fence, but they haven't been lined up near the property line, taking that next step in creating a fence. Therefore, they're ready to be loaded up on a wagon and taken by the seller wherever he's going next. The Mishnah teaches that one who sells a field has not sold the reeds in the vineyard that are not designated for its use. So the Gemara explains, according to Rabbi Meir, this is referring to a case where the reeds are not smoothed, whereas according to the rabbis, the reference is to reeds that are not yet set in their place, even if they are smoothed. And the Mishnah further teaches one who sells a field has also not sold the produce that is detached from the ground. We've discussed that. And the Gemara comments, the produce is not included in the sale, even though it still requires the ground. That is, it needs to be left in the field in order to dry out completely. That's interesting, right? You harvested the grain, but before you can sell it, it needs to dry out. It needs to stay in that place for a few more weeks. So you might think that since that grain needs the field, needs that place in order to dry out, that if you sold the field while it was sitting there, that it would be included in the sale. But since it's detached, since it's ready to be sold, but for that drying period, it's considered not part of the field, but rather separate property of the owner. The Mishnah teaches that one who sells a field has not sold the cluster of reeds that occupy a base rova, because a base rova is an area that can be considered a separate field. Now the Gemara comments, and this is so even if they are thin, as since they occupy the area of a base rova, they are considered a separate entity and are not part of the field. And concerning this ruling, Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says it is not only a cluster of reeds that is considered a separate entity and therefore not included in the sale, rather even a small garden bed of spices that does not occupy the area of a base rova, but has a distinct name, a garden, as opposed to a field, it is not sold along with the field. So Rav Papa said what this means is that people call it the roses of so-and-so, thereby establishing for it a name of its own. So I think I made a mistake earlier when I said that this base rova is defined by the reeds that surround it. Now I'm understanding it that what they're saying is a cluster of reeds, meaning he's selling you a field, and within that field there's an area where reeds grow, a cluster of reeds. Well, if that cluster is big enough that it's a base rova of reeds, so that's a separate field, like a field of reeds. But if it's smaller than that, then it's more like an asset of the field that it has reeds growing there that can be used on that field. The Mishnah teaches that the sale does not include the watch station that is plastered with clay. The Mishnah teaches that the sale does not include the watch station that is plastered with clay, meaning I think I was saying earlier, because they were saying it's not included if it's not plastered with clay. Now they're saying it's not included if it is plastered with clay. I guess even if it is plastered with clay, because it's a watch station on its own. It's like its own house, its own property, its own separate entity. The Mishnah teaches that the sale does not include the watch station that is plastered with clay. And the Gemara comments, and this is the law even though it is attached to the ground, as it is still considered a separate entity and not part of the field. So the Mishnah teaches he has also not sold the carob tree that has been grafted, and he has not sold the sycamore trunk. And the Gemara notes, even though they are small, they are considered a separate entity. They certainly could be sold along with the field, but if the deal only specified I'm selling you a field, this would be considered not included. Apropos the discussion of a watch station that is attached to the ground, the Gemara cites a discussion about the sale of a house. Rabbi Elazar raised the dilemma. With regard to wooden door frames, what is the law? Are they sold together with the house or not? Now, what? I'm selling a house. I'm selling you a house. How could the house not include the door frame? Doesn't that seem very integral to the house? And what they're saying is, again, different building materials, different customs 2,000 years ago. They're saying they would build a house of bricks, of stones, of mud, hard walls, and they would leave openings. And they might even leave you the door. But what's the door frame or the window frame, right? That was actually more like a hanging painting or a hanging poster. The door frame, which it really had two jobs to do. One was to seal the space between the door and the opening of the door in the house, and the other was to be ornamental. And so door frames, which were really kind of filling that space around the door, between the door and the door opening, where they acted as insulation, but also acted as decoration. And this really was something that was made. It could be made out of clay. It could be made out of wooden pegs. It could be quite decorative. And it was something that people would take with them. They would take their door frame with them, or they would take their window frame with them. And for that reason, it was not necessarily considered part of the house. Now, if it had become integrated, then it might be. So let's keep reading. So Rabbi Elazar raised the dilemma. With regard to wooden door frames, what is the law? Are they sold together with the house or not? And the Gemara explains the question. Do not raise the dilemma in a case where the frames are attached to the house with clay, as they are certainly attached to the house, and they are sold along with it. When you raise this dilemma is when they are connected only with small wooden pegs. Then what is the ruling? And no resolution was found for this question, and so teku, that dilemma stands unresolved. Rabbi Zera raises a similar dilemma about what is included in the sale of a house. With regard to window frames, what is the law? Are they sold together with the house or not? Do we say that they serve merely as an ornament and are not included in the sale, and the seller can remove them from the house and keep them for himself? Or perhaps, since they are attached to the window, they are attached. And again, teku, unresolved. And similarly, Rabbi Yirmiyah raised a dilemma with regard to the stands for the legs of a bed that are placed under the legs to prevent them from being damaged by moisture from the ground. What is the law? And the Gemara explains the question. Do not raise a dilemma wherever the stands move along with the bed, as they move along with it and therefore not considered part of the house. Where you can raise the dilemma is where they do not move along with the bed. Then what is the ruling? Teku was unresolved. And the Mishnah teaches one who sells a field has not sold the carob tree that has been grafted, and he has not sold the sycamore trunk. Now we're on page 69b. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters, i.e. that a grafted carob and a sycamore trunk are not included in the sale of a field derived? And Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, as the verse states, so the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre the field, and the cave that was within it, and all the trees that were in the field, that were all in the boundaries, that were in all the boundaries around, they were established for Abraham as a possession. Right? When Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah as a burial place for Sarah, and this is still the burial place that you can visit in Hebron. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, and Adam and Eve are all buried there. And this is when Abraham bought that place. And this teaches that anything that requires a boundary around it, as it does not have natural demarcations, is included in the sale of a field. And this excludes these trees, i.e. the grafted carob and the sycamore trunk, which do not require a boundary around them, as they stand out individually on their own. And Rav Misharshia says, from here, there is a source, that the acquisition of the actual boundaries in a sale is by Torah law, not just rabbinic law. Rabbi Yehuda said, one who sells land to another must write for him the following in the bill of sale. Acquire for yourself the palm trees and the dates and the branches and the seedlings. And even if he did not write this for him, the buyer would still acquire all of these entities, as demonstrated by the Mishnah that it is only a grafted carob and a sycamore trunk that are excluded from the sale of a field. Even so, it is an enhancement of the bill of sale that he write all the details of the transaction so that there be no possible room for disagreement. If the seller said to the buyer, I am selling you the land and palm trees, we consider this situation. So if he has palm trees, he must give him 2 palm trees, as 2 is the minimum number of trees that would justify being called trees in the plural. And if he has no palm trees, he must buy 2 palm trees for him somewhere else. And if he has palm trees, but they are mortgaged to another person, he must redeem 2 of those palm trees and give them to the buyer, because he said, I'm selling you the land with the trees. So it has to include trees. And what kind of trees are considered significant? Palm trees, date palms. If the seller said to the buyer, I am selling you land with palm trees, we consider the situation. If there are palm trees on the land, he must give him the land. And if not, this is a mistaken transaction, and the sale is void. If the seller said to the buyer, I am selling you land of palm trees, the buyer has no claim to receive palm trees. Therefore, if the land has no palm trees, this is not a mistaken transaction, because the seller was saying to him, this is land that is fit for palm trees, and not that it already contained palm trees. Furthermore, if the seller said to the buyer that he is selling the land except for such and such a palm tree, we consider. And if it is a good palm tree, we assume that he retained only that one for himself and he did not include it in the sale. But if it is a bad palm tree, we assume that all the more so did he retain for himself the other ones that are of higher quality. If the seller said to the buyer that he is selling him the entire field except for the trees, we consider the situation. If he has different types of trees in the field, for example, olive and fig trees, he has sold the entire field except for the trees. If he has only palm trees in the field, we assume that he meant to sell the entire field except for the palm trees, even though one does not ordinarily refer to palm trees by the more general term trees. And similarly, if he has only grapevines in the field, the buyer acquires everything except for the grapevines. If the field has both trees and grapevines, he has sold everything except for the trees. Therefore, the buyer does not acquire the trees, which the seller excluded from the sale, but he does acquire the grapevines. And similarly, if in the field there are both trees and palm trees, he has sold everything except for the trees. If there are no other trees in the field, but only grapevines and palm trees, everything, including the palm trees, is sold except for the grapevines, which we assume the seller reserved for himself. He's not giving away the most valuable asset unless he specifies that he's giving away the most valuable asset. Rav says if the seller specified that he is selling a field but not the trees, any tree that is so tall that one must climb by rope in order to harvest its fruit is retained and is not included in the sale. And any tree that one need not climb by rope is not retained and is sold along with the field. I'm very close to done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Page 70a at the top. But the judges of the exile, means Shmuel and Karna, they say any tree that is bent back by the yoke of oxen, as the animals plow the ground under the tree, and in this way the tree does not impede the plowing, this is not retained by the seller, as this is not a significant tree, right? If the yoke bends the tree as it goes by, it's a young tree, and it's part of the field. Any tree that is not bent back by the yoke of the oxen is retained by the seller and is not included in the sale. And the Gemara comments, and these Amoraim, these sages of the Gemara, do not disagree with regard to the law, that which Rav said, that only the trees that the seller retains for himself and excludes from the sale are those that must be climbed by means of a rope, because that was said with regard to palm trees. While that which the judges of the exile said, that only trees that are retained are those that are not bent back by the yoke of the oxen, this was said with regard to other types of trees. And there we will conclude and take a few questions. Lorraine says from a few days ago, in respect to a mikvah, how do today's rabbis reconcile the rainwater to be halakhically okay with all the pollution and even acid rain, etc.? What a great question. Because even in ancient times, they did talk about filtering the water, but they had to do it in such a way that it would not become drawn water, like water from a well. So I just can't answer the question. I do not know the nuances of how mikvahs are very clean. There's no question about that. The water is treated. I don't know if it's chlorinated, filtered. I mean, when you go to a mikvah, the water is clean. So the origin of the water has to be, rainwater or water from a river, etc. But it is cleaned before people go in it. But the particular nuances of that are deep and many and difficult, right? So anybody you talk to that has built a mikvah, and so many Chabad rabbis were sent out into far-flung destinations to build a Chabad house, to build a synagogue, to build a community, to build a preschool, to start having services, etc. They will build a mikvah. It's one of the first orders of business. And, they're rabbis who are training to be congregational rabbis. They're not rabbis who are training to be architects and specialists in building mikvahs, but they have to learn that body of law in order to do it. And it's a big challenge. I've talked to rabbis that have done it. It's difficult. It's definitely difficult. And they will bring in experts for sure to help them do that. Tom says, if the grafted carob and the sycamore trunk are not included in the sale, do they still belong to the seller? Right, exactly. So it's the same kind of idea that we talked about, weeks ago, where you would retain a tree. Well, if you retain the tree, but you sold the field that the tree is standing in, how are you going to get to the tree, right? Do you also need an easement to be able to walk through that field to get to it? Do you have to pay for that? Maybe you do. Maybe you have to negotiate for that. Maybe you kept the path, maybe you didn't. But what they're saying is that a tree is a significant enough asset, especially a date palm, that was, very valuable producing those dates, And when you said I'm selling you a field, that does not necessarily mean that I'm selling you that productive date palm that is in the middle of it. How I'm going to get to it is a different question. And finally, Sharon says, clarification, please, is based on yesterday's class. Are non-Jewish slaves all considered Canaanite slaves? It's a really good question. I'm not sure. My feeling is, my instinct says, yeah. The distinction is simply Jews, when they are enslaved, it's not a permanent enslavement, right? As we've talked about. It's for a period of 6 years. And then they go free, and when they go free, you have to give them gifts, etc. Why did they become slaves in the first place? Because they committed a crime and couldn't pay what they owe, or they became so indebted they had no other way to live, and so they sold themselves into slavery. But that is for a finite period of time. The slave could then choose to remain with the master, and then they would remain until the Yovel, till the Jubilee year. So Canaanite slaves means non-Jewish slaves, the way I understand it, not necessarily that they came from the land of Canaan, but they would be treated differently. As we've said many times, thank God there's no more slavery and hasn't been for many, many centuries. But when there was, so a Canaanite slave was a permanent slave that could be passed from, a father to a son, etc. It was inheritable like land. And I don't think that there's a distinction made between, a slave that originated in Canaan and maybe one that was purchased by a Jew from, some non-Jewish seller who brought that slave from some far-off land. I think would still have the same laws as what we call the Canaanite slave. That's my impression. I could be wrong. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.